Good morning. Good morning. My name is Thomas Gaehtgens, and as the director of the Getty Research Institute, I would like to welcome you to this international conference, which will focus on the history of the museums in Latin America. Most of the speakers have come from far away to participate and to share their knowledge and experience in this field. Let me welcome all of you, especially our friends who came from Europe, Latin America, and the East Coast, as well as you, the members of the audience who are interested in this topic. I hope you all have by now heard about the Getty's initiative, Pacific Standard Time, LALA, which has supported over 70 exhibitions that are due to open across Los Angeles and Southern California in mid-September of this year. Many programs are being organized in conjunction with these shows, lectures, workshops, discussions, and conferences. Our symposium today, in a certain way, kicks off this agglomeration of PST events, but in a certain way, we also wanted to flee this agglomeration. For more information, I encourage you to visit the website pacificstandardtime.org, Pacific Standard Time without .org. The history of Latin American museums has not been, in my view, thoroughly addressed in scholarly publications until now, though several of our speakers have published or are in the process of publishing some studies on this topic. The theme is fascinating and challenging at the same time. The creation of museums in Latin American countries has to be studied as a process that took place during the periods when individual nations, states, emerged from the wars of independence. The museums became places to identify, to encounter, and to integrate different traditions and cultures, and to define a new national identity. This development took place in very different ways in the various countries. We will probably learn that North American or European models played a major role in this process. However, we will also see that these models could only be adapted to a certain degree because of the very different conditions and the encounter of identities with very different traditions in the Latin American countries. In the organization of this symposium, we took a broad approach that included art museums, as well as museums with archaeological and ethnographic collections. We also chose to invite a few speakers who would take us beyond Latin America and illustrate case examples that involved collecting, archiving, and displaying pre-Columbian, Latin American, and Latino art in Europe and the US. Overall, we are not presenting an exhaustive survey of museums in Latin America, but select cases that illuminate the diverse and contrasting contexts and processes that gave rise to museums in several Latin American countries. I'm deeply grateful to all the speakers who have devoted time, energy, and their scholarly experience and have plunged courageously into this topic. We will definitely be confronted with new material and very original interpretations. We have the privilege that our eminent colleague and friend, Miguel Hal Fernandez, the former national coordinator of museums and exhibitions of the National Institute of Anthropology and History, INA, in Mexico, has joined us today. He, of course, does not need a lot of words of introduction. Miguel Angel will moderate the first session and also present some final remarks at the end of this symposium. Not only did he write the history of Mexican museums, but he has also participated in the foundation of more than 30 museums throughout the country, in the adaptation and remodeling of several monumental and historic spaces as a part of museographic projects, as well as the creation of hundreds of national and international exhibitions. Miguel Angel, still extremely active, recently helped to plan, build, and install the International Baroque Museum in Puebla, Mexico, a wonderful museum dedicated to the display of Baroque art and culture around the world, and has an innovative approach to the concept and the idea of a museum. Before turning over to Miguel Angel, let me thank my co-organizing of this event, Aleka Leblanc from the University of California, Riverside, Elena Stromberg from the University of Utah, and especially Kim Richter, senior research specialist at the GRI, who took the initiative, not only for the organization, but also for the concept of this international symposium. Our deepest thanks also go to Jennifer de la Fuente and Marisa del Toro. You wouldn't be here without them, who planned and carried out the logistics for this event. And now please join me in welcoming Miguel Hal Fernandez.
Well, good morning to you all, and thank you, Dr. Thomas Gaehtgens, for being so kind. I know myself, and if I improvise today, I will never stop talking. So I will do that tomorrow. So I will restrain myself today and just read 2 paragraphs about what a moderator should do and the 3 extraordinary speakers that we have this morning. This symposium is a very necessary event. 50 years ago, when I began to work in museums, much before internet and before the appearance of books and particular papers on the museum work on the subject, there was nothing about the birth of Latin American museums. But this historical mistake is rapidly changing thanks to you. It is for that reason that I want to congratulate the Getty Research Institute, Dr. Thomas Gaehtgens and his team, and also the state of California for keeping contact with Latin America. Let me sincerely tell you that it is a privilege to be here today, and I came, as Dr. Gaehtgens says, from far away, just to listen and to learn from you all. So it is me who thanks you for your presence today. Let me introduce now the first speaker this morning, Dr. Irina Podgorny from Argentina. Dr. Podgorny is a permanent research scholar at the CONICET and director of the Historical Archives of La Plata Museum in Argentina. Her research interests include history of science and medicine, natural history museums, and history of paleontological and archaeological collections, fields in which she has published extensively. She is also a visiting professor in Rio de Janeiro, Wolford College, Université Diderot, University of Toulouse, Barnard College, and the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science and the IKKM Bauhaus University in Weimar. Dr. Irina, the podium is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much for this invitation. I thank you, especially Kim Richter and all the staff and team from the Getty Research Institute, and Jennifer and Maris as well for helping us for being here. Yesterday when I arrived to the US and cross migration, the officer in charge asked me, "What do you do?" And I replied, "Well, I am a historian of science. I'm here for a conference." But what exactly do you do? It's history. It's history of museums. museums. They have a history, track, and I was in the US. So, and I think, I wanted I think we are here to prove that museums have a history, and not only museums have a history, but also Latin American museums as well. And I thank you for this opportunity to prove that there is a history to be told. So late in the 1980s, this is not my presentation, is it? Okay. No. And then the clickers. Okay. Late in the 1980s, Susan Sheets Pinson pioneered the comparative approach of analyzing non-European museums in an intercontinental perspective. In her Cathedrals of Science, the museums in Australia, Canada, and Argentina were inserted in a network of data, collections, publications, theories, and people, which made them comparable and visible. Recent research has emphasized that some of these museums were also connected with international networks created by the Spanish and Portuguese 18th century colonial administration. Expeditions and instructions issued from the metropolis activated local agents and shaped local collecting cultures. Heirs of these initiatives saw themselves as intellectual associates. So, this is the list of the museums created late in the 19th century. And I like to include on that list also the American Museum. So, because I think it is important to keep in mind that there are trends that crosses both Americas. It is not just a question of Latin American creations, but the dates and the trends are shared in both sides of the Rio Grande. So we can see that late in the 18th century, cabinets and botanical gardens and expeditions were created, and that is linked with the creation in Madrid of the Real Gabinete of Natural History, created in 1771, and which was, in fact, the destination of some of the collections gathered in those institutions. So it is important to take in mind that these spaces created in Spanish America were just a place where things were collected to be shipped to Madrid, or in the case of Brazil, to Coimbra or Lisbon. So this is one of the most famous shipments made from Buenos Aires, which is the Megatherium, giant skeleton, a mega mammal, how it's called, which was shipped to Madrid late in the 18th century. But the establishment of the new museums, in a moment that Miruna Ahim, a Mexican historian of museums, called the trial years, give us another set of museums created between the 1810s and 1820s in all the important cities all across Latin America: Mexico and Bogota, Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, Santiago de Chile, Lima, and as I said before, I also like to include Charleston in South Carolina as one of the creations that took place in the same moment and which faced the same difficulties. So, which means this ephemeral character, the same kind of collections, which were very general collections, and the problem of finding a space to host them, and how to survive in a moment of political problems. Historiography has treated the years around the growth of the new Spanish and Portuguese Americas, independent nations in the 1820s, at the point of origin from which each Latin American nation began to construct its own identity and destiny. but a more detailed examination reveals a political, social, and economic panorama filled with ambiguity, contradictions, confusions, and rupture, as well as continuities. So it is important to ask ourselves what remains from those collections and from those collections. In an article published by Maria Paola Rodriguez Prada from Colombia about the early history of the National Museum of Colombia, she shows that the only two objects that survived from those collections are those things kept now in Paris. So these are things that were dispatched to Paris for the mining school, and that shows first how the collections were very weak in a way, and on the other hand, that the people in charge of those collections were collecting for shipping abroad and to show abroad which kind of resources the country had. In this case, minerals and what kind of things Colombia could offer to the world. Other things that survive from those years, from the 10th and 20th, are the dreams, how they conceive, of how the museums were conceived in those years. This is the frontispiece of a journal published in the 30s in Buenos Aires. The journal was the Museo Americano, and you see here a neoclassical building, which of course never existed, but which intended to show that the Museo Americano was a place where one could gather all the objects and all the knowledge from the world. And this is something that also very important, that those museums created in the 20s were not linked, or were not only linked to Latin American things, but to the world. They were general museums. They wanted to display not only what was specific from Latin America, but on the contrary, they wanted to display what the world was and how Latin America or the new nations related to those places. I will now take the case of the creation of the museum in Buenos Aires, the first initiative from the 10th, early in the 10th. So the revolutionary movement in Argentina started in 1810. And 2 years later, there was an instruction which in fact followed the same structure the colonial instructions had, to encourage people and the citizens from Argentina didn't exist, but let's say Argentina, let's call that part of the world Argentina, to collect and to send to Buenos Aires samples of the natural world. So they require, yes, thank you. They requested information about plants and animals and minerals, but as well, they requested ideas about how to ship to Buenos Aires the things that people were collecting in the provinces. So these instructions talked about a collective enterprise. It was not, the museum was supposed not to be the work of a group of scholars, but it was something that today could be called citizen science. So it was the people who decided what to ship, and how to organize the museum. And the thing which is very peculiar, and it is also something that is shared in all Latin America, that even when they were replicating the kind of instructions shipped or sent by Madrid before, they insisted on the topic that Madrid has left the colonies in a complete darkness. So the topic, which is very common in Latin America after independence, that Madrid was a kind of dark place which didn't pay attention to science. It is here even when they were replicating what Spain had done. So this museum, in fact, didn't prosper. So the instructions were sent to the officers in the provinces, and there are just a couple of answers and sending things and saying, well, we did the same in the past with the colonial administration. But the important thing is that this kind of instructions, as the colonial instruction did before, activated agents in the provinces and in the city, and activated the act of collecting. So people were collecting, and this is important to underline, were collecting not just because they wanted to do so, but there were some kind of instructions existing and acting there that encouraged people to collect. And why did people collect and send things? So this is a question that has to be solved, because why people are presenting without getting money things to the government? Why, if the animals, the plants, they are common property, but this is an act that we don't think about that. Why people are offering those things to the government? The thing is that people did, and in the case of Buenos Aires, we have a priest, which was also active in the independent movement, that had been collecting for about 20 years, and when the government decided to create a museum, he gave to the government his collections, which included books and books about mineralogy, chemistry, instruments, and a shell collection. Adam Selen, who is going to talk next, he has worked on another priest, two brothers from Mérida, who also collected shells in 19th century Yucatan. And so we can see connections across the Americas where you have the same kind of agents doing the same kind of things. And this is something that, even when probably you are expecting specificities, I want to underline what these common things that have to be taken in mind we do history museums. So those things which are very, very local, as priest lost in Buenos Aires, is doing the same things as another priest in Yucatan. Why? They don't know each other. So why they are doing the same things? Yeah. The thing is that these collections show that there was a kind of culture related to collecting, and the role of priests in that culture, but also another kind of agents that were present in those times, which are the physicians and the military engineers from colonial times that stayed in Latin America and continued to gathering the things they collected. So some of the motivation they always claimed was the love of God, el amor al real servicio, which is the love of the royal service, or just personal interest. But the thing is that through the museum articulated this private interest with the creation of a public repository for all citizens. What we have in the 10th and 20th is an interest in mining, an interest in mineral and natural resources, also a very a strong relationship with the French model, and in particular with the Museum of Natural History from Paris. And this kind of inspiration that the museum had on Latin American countries is something that you can find in Bogotá, in Buenos Aires, and in Rio de Janeiro. You also have a universal character. So, for instance, in Mexico, you have African birds, a collection of African birds. In Buenos Aires, you have a collection of ancient coins or French minerals. You have that the collections are not closed. The collections are very open. They work as a store. They can be sold. They can be given. So the museum is something very open. Things enter and go. They are general. They have no focuses, so they can gather antiquities, natural history, art, industry, and they are also linked to the teaching of science, or they are linked to mining schools. Connected with the fact that the museums were open, it is important to see how, for instance, the museums related the selling of part of their collections or manuscript collections for acquiring other objects. Leonardo López Luján has worked on that, but Miruna Ahim has showed how in the first years of the Museum of Mexico, the person in charge sold the plates made in colonial times, the plates in the archaeological plates in Palenque and the ruins, and he wanted to have African birds. So he thought it was more important to have a collection of African birds than to have something related to the Mexican ruins. And this shows how this idea of identity is very complex. So the museum was not linked to something local, but they prefer to have a collection showing the diversity of the natural world. So these are the plates that later were published in France, and which in a way are also marking the birth of the study of American antiquities. So the French are buying these plates for rediscovering what the Spanish exploration had discovered in the 18th century. But they bought these things and they were creating a new discipline. So you have in Buenos Aires, also in the 20s, the creation of a museum which will survive. It's also a museum connected with the teaching of science. But the thing is that, again, we see here something which is not very clear. The goals are not clear. They want to have a museum, but when instructions are requested regarding what kind of collection the museum should have, the answer is con lo que venga. So, which is something very, which will mark the destiny of, at least in Argentina, not only museums, but the country in general, how we organize the country, con lo que venga. And this shows also what this relationship between a state and goals and what happens, and in fact, what is history is not defined in a very structured way, but it is adapted to the local conditions. And the local conditions indicated we are not in a position, it is a very complicated decade, to decide the materials that will form our collections. So this, it's also related to, they try to hire staff in Europe. And the staff that was hired also was a kind of whatever we can find. And they found two Italians working in London, in exile in London, who decided to come to Buenos Aires. They directed the museum for a while, but they were in fact more linked to pharmacy, and they established a pharmacy just in front of the museum, and they ran the museum in connection with the pharmacy they have on the other side of the street. So this relation to pharmacy is also that serves a deeper study, because the pharmacy is also something very similar to the museum. And if we take in mind that the museum was open, was also treated as as a place where things could be sold. So this relationship, which happens also in other places, and if we remember that priests were connected also with pharmacy, so there are connections that I think are worth of more attention. So the thing is that when these people arrive, and that happens in Buenos Aires many times, the government that hired them didn't exist anymore. So, and this is something happening every time. So they arrive and they have to adapt to the new conditions. So the condition of hiring didn't exist. And the building, because the dream was to have a building with a theater for teaching of medicine and so on and so on, but nothing happened, and the only place where the museum could be established was in the church in Buenos Aires. It was given a floor, and the collections were displayed there. So, what we have here is this ephemeral character. The new museums formed throughout the 19th century in the republics of America and in the Brazilian Empire were inspired by the model of the Paris Museum of Natural History. They inserted themselves in European networks where they figured in the elaboration of new scientific fields of study. The establishment of museums and cabinets in the new nations of the Americas is linked not only to independence, but also to the expansion of different disciplines such as comparative anatomy, paleontology, and archaeology. That is worth remarking, appeared almost at the same time. Within the span of a very few years, the new governments or collectors with the resources to do so began to establish museums. The dates indicate trends that cannot be explained by European attitudes, such as those promoted in the context of the late 18th century exploring expeditions and Spanish reforms. Many of these collections grew out of the mix between commercial culture, the passion of the Enlightenment for science and nature, and the trade expectation of the new republics. Many of those creations were ephemeral. Institutional accounts and current historiography have tended to make a connection with later surviving establishments. From a historiographic point of view, however, one may ask whether it is legitimate to insist on these connections, which tend to canonize a notion of permanence attaching to present-day museums. So, as you know, we tend to believe that a museum is something permanent. And the history of Latin American museums show that even when they were not permanent, they existed and have a history. And now, I just wanted to show some of the surviving institutions, and they were very well known, which were created in the second half of the 19th century. I will not discuss in depth these museums, but these museums that existed or were established in Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, Santiago de Chile, were described as scientific, so it is important to insist on the fact that the first museums were more related to natural history than to archaeology or art. And these museums are also collected with what was called the German scientific diaspora. So they were in charge of scientists of German origin, and such as Hermann von Jering in Museo Paulista in Sao Paulo. And here you have the monumental Museum of La Plata, which now is seen as a museum of natural history, but in fact was a public museum, a general museum, even with collection of art and industry, established in 1884 in the new capital of the province of Buenos Aires, which was this art, well, the floor plans. It was negotiation made by a rich person from Argentina, which donated himself with the condition of having a monumental building and a salary for himself. So it is important to remark that in Latin America there was not a Peabody, neither a Carnegie nor a Field. So all the museums created in Latin America were state-run institutions, but with the problem that the state didn't know why they have a museum. So the problem is that in Latin America, at least in Argentina, what you have is that the people working in the museum, the directors, have to justify why there is a museum. To whom? To the employer, which is the state. And so you have all the time this kind of permanent game. So we are here and we are here trying to show you why you are paying me. And this is something very peculiar, because we tend to see that the museums were tools of the state, trying to control everything. But in fact, when you see the museums from below, not very below, but from the point of view of the director, you see that the museums are being run by the will of the director, and the state is there paying, saying, well, we have a museum, it is important to have a museum, but not always sure why it has to survive. But the same thing, it is important to underline, is happening in France. So there is a very interesting article called about the history of the Museum of Natural History in Paris, a very emblematic, a very iconic museum. But the author, Claude Schnitter, shows that the directors were always fighting to, and the article calls to adapt or perish, to survive. So because science is there, and they are, but you don't know what kind of utility a museum can have. So, and the thing is that this museum, the man that organized the museum, did achieve a goal that not everybody could achieve in Latin America. It's the only building built for a museum. So it was designed for a museum from the very beginning, which is not the case from most of the museums. Even the museum, the Museum of La Plata was a provincial museum. The Museo Nacional, the National Museum of Buenos Aires, was hosted after the church in a colonial building, which was populated with collections, and things were almost hidden from the visitor because nothing could be displayed. So over-collapsed. And there you see the only archaeological piece from the National Museum of Buenos Aires, this pottery on the top. This was, well, there on the surface, But the thing is that the National Museum Buenos Aires, until the 1930s, could not have a big museum, a big building, which in fact was built, but only a third of the planning project. So this is the Museo Paulista in Sao Paulo, which in fact seems to be a museum, but was a monument devoted to independence, and later recycled for a museum of natural history. The same with the museum, the National Museum in Montevideo, which was hosted by the Teatro Solís, the Solís Theater, and well, and other places in general that were, or even in Mexico, were hosted in old buildings, old colonial buildings, and we have a long history of recycling and adapting to places and spaces which were not designed for being what they were. So, what we have at the end of the 19th century is a variety of museums, from national to provincial, from monumental to one-room shows, from general to those devoted to a single subject, from lost to still existing. A wide variety of institutions in North, Central, and South America appeared in a century that witnesses the last reforms of the Iberian empires, the impact of Napoleonic politics, the long processes inaugurated by the wars of revolution and independence, the establishment of the Brazilian Empire in Brazil, and the convoluted configurations of the new Latin American republics. By the close of the 19th century, South and Central American museums, like the museums of Europe, Asia, and elsewhere, served as research centers for ethnographic and natural science. They vied with each other for authority and acted as complementary spaces in their respective areas of expertise. Late in the 19th century, the agency of South and Central American museums is clear. In addition to partnering with institutions in the Northern Hemisphere, they established regional networks of exchange, publication, collections, duplicates. They were, in every sense, intentional actors in the common dynamics that shaped the museums of both sides of the Atlantic, and to use the vocabulary of the time, both above and below the equator. For this reason, it is not stretching too long above to claim that Latin American institutions provide a paradigmatic model for understanding the local articulation of global scientific and also artistic practices and disciplines. Well, and with this, I've finished and hope.
Thank you, Doctora Podgorny. And our next speaker will be Rafael Cardozo. Rafael is a writer and an art historian holding a PhD from the Courtauld Institute of Art. He's also the author of numerous books on the history of Brazilian art and design. Rafael is also active as an independent curator. He's linked to the Instituto de Artes da Universidade do Estado de Rio de Janeiro, but presently Rafael lives in Berlin. He was a guest scholar at the Getty Research Institute in 2015. Rafael, the podium is yours.
Good morning. First of all, I want to thank the GRI for inviting me, and for especially the staff, Jennifer Del Fuente and Marisa Del Toro, who worked hard to make sure that I'm here. I want to thank also the organizers, Thomas Gaehtgens, Kim Richter, Aleka LeBlanc, and Elena Stromberg. I really appreciate the opportunity to be back here in LA with you today. Let me begin with something topical. Last month, on April 5th, the newspaper Correio Brasiliense reported that a worker who was painting the outside of the National Museum in Brasilia scrawled the slogan "Fora Temer," Temer out, on its dome. Oops, sorry. You can see here. The protest itself was hardly newsworthy, as the phrase has become a routine rallying cry ever since the former vice president took power in August 2016. The surprising angle of this story for most Brazilian readers is the fact that there is a national museum in Brasilia. Designed by Oscar Niemeyer and inaugurated on the date of the architect's 99th birthday in 2006, this concrete shell covering 14,500 square meters occasionally hosts temporary exhibitions. To call it a museum, that's this here, to call it a museum begs the question, a museum of what? Its emptiness, actual and conceptual, is a potent symbol of the dilemma my presentation will seek to address. Newcomers to the world of Brazilian art history may find themselves struggling with the confusing nomenclature used to designate the National Museum of Fine Arts in Rio de Janeiro. The official name, as seen on the bronze plaque on the facade here, is Museu Nacional de Belas Artes. That often gets abbreviated to Museu de Belas Artes, dropping the national, usually in conversation, but also sometimes in print. Occasionally, and especially in Sao Paulo newspapers, the name gets rendered as Museu de Belas Artes do Rio de Janeiro. This is no minor matter of geographical precision, but a strategic slight deriving from the old rivalry between the two cities. Since 1932, at least, when a full-blown civil war was fought between the state of Sao Paulo and the federal government, Paulistas have often balked at Rio's claims to speak for the nation as a whole. After the capital was removed from Rio to Brasilia in 1960, leaving numerous national institutions stranded in a city that no longer had any hold on power, such resentment descended into open contempt. I want to steer away from the issue of regional antagonisms, however. My contention here is that the difficulty of conceiving of Brazil's national museums as national runs much deeper than that. Even more confusingly for the newcomer, at least three major museums in Rio de Janeiro that display works of art in their collections have some combination of the title National Museum in their names. The oldest is the Museu Nacional, here, essentially a museum of natural history, archaeology, and anthropology belonging to the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. It was originally founded in 1818 as the Royal Museum by King Dom João VI, Don John VI, during the 13-year period when the Portuguese Empire had its seat in Rio de Janeiro, and later rechristened as National Museum in 1892, when the newly founded republic renamed all institutions bearing royal or imperial in their names. Its administration was transferred to the university in 1946. Next comes the Museu Histórico Nacional, a museum of national history inaugurated in 1922, the centenary of Brazilian independence. This institution was conceived very much in the vein of using museums to construct and project a particular vision of the nation, in the sense enshrined by Benedict Anderson's writings on imagined communities and widely explored in museum studies ever since. The third is our old friend, the Museu Nacional de Belas Artes, or MNBA for short, which only came into being in 1937, at a time when the Vargas regime engaged in a flurry of reorganizing older institutions and creating new ones as part of its construction of the dictatorial Estado Novo, or new state. As you can see from this brief chronology, the MNBA is by no means the oldest art museum in the country. São Paulo's Pinacoteca do Estado was established in 1905, and even a modest regional museum like the Museu de Arte da Bahia predates its national counterpart by almost 2 decades. Nonetheless, the MNBA's problems with entitlement do not stem from lack of pedigree or clout. Among museums in Brazil dedicated solely to art, it possesses by far the largest and oldest collections, including a unique set of European works brought over by the Portuguese crown, as well as the lion's share of the official acquisitions made by the nation over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. Yet, despite its indisputable eminence in the Brazilian museum world, the MNBA has consistently played a low-key and unglamorous role over its institutional existence. Both of its Sao Paulo counterparts, the Pinacoteca do Estado and the Museu de Arte de São Paulo, enjoy much greater popularity and prestige. Even this summary exposition makes it clear, I hope, that Brazil has no undisputed national art museum in the sense of an institution where the idea of the nation and its art treasures come together in triumphal display. I want to argue here today that the absence of such a setting reflects not a deficiency on the part of any one institution, but rather a broader failing of the idea of national art and culture. The late sociologist Otávio Yanni wrote in the 1990s that Brazil was not yet a nation, properly speaking, only a national state in the process of achieving nationhood. By this, he meant that Brazil is a society at war with itself, unable to embrace its past and complete the transformation of its populace into a convincing idea of the people. This astute observation has proved truer than ever over the political crises of the past few years. Building national museums is, as we all know, a historical part of the process of building nations. And both museums and nations are a way of organizing time and space. In an article titled Duty-Free Art, Hito Steil drew attention to the paradigm of the museum, to how the paradigm of the museum is shifting in the age of Starchitect-designed franchises, hedge fund collecting, free port storage spaces, and the willful erosion of the nation-state into what she terms extra statecraft. Our standing conception of museums and the nations they represent is being smashed to pieces, she says, by the new imperatives of data capitalism. What the Brazilian case illustrates starkly and disturbingly is how easily such a conception can be dismantled when it was never fully consolidated in the first place. It doesn't take much to smash to pieces what was already broken from the start. In order to understand the fragmentary nature of Brazil's national art collections, it is necessary to examine their history. The original kernel was the royal collection brought to Rio de Janeiro from Lisbon in 1808, when the Portuguese crown fled the Napoleonic invasion and relocated the court to its Brazilian colony. Besides paintings and sculptures, prints and drawings, the transfer included the Royal Library, which became the nucleus of what is today Brazil's National Library. I have deliberately left that institution out in an attempt to simplify an already complicated discussion, but it is important to be aware that the original collection has spawned even more offspring than just the museums we are focusing on here. To that first kernel was added a second collection of European artworks purchased in Paris and taken to Rio de Janeiro by Joaquim Le Breton in 1816. Until the defeat of Napoleon, Le Breton had been perpetual secretary for art at the Institut de France, where he is best remembered for provoking the British over the Parthenon marbles. Removed from the Institut after the Bourbon Restoration, he accepted an invitation from the Portuguese crown and formed a company of 17 artists and master craftsmen to emigrate to Brazil with the intention of setting up a royal school of arts and crafts. Among the materials and equipments they took with them was a study collection of 42 paintings, mostly copies of old masters, to which were added an additional 12 purchased the following year. When Dom João VI returned to Portugal in 1821, he left both this and his own collection behind. Brazil was declared an independent nation the following year, and ownership of the crown's artistic property entered a murky period only resolved during the 1830s. Thus, the first noteworthy characteristic of Brazil's national art collections is that they precede the legal existence of the nation-state, as well as that of the institution to which they notionally belonged. Their origin is inextricably linked to Europe, to colonialism, and to exile. The Imperial Academy of Fine Arts opened in 1826, but its gallery was only organized as a distinct entity in 1843. It was designated by the classical term pinacoteca and was essentially intended for study purposes. The purchase of paintings, prints, and casts from Europe intensified greatly over the ensuing decades. From the 1840s onwards, the Academy also systematically collected original works, mainly via acquisitions from its general exhibition, or salon, which was staged on a semi-biennial basis during the imperial period. Prize-winning works were purchased from exhibiting artists and paid for by government funds. The collections grew further thanks to the submission of copies and originals produced by students the Academy sent abroad, usually to Paris or Rome, as recipients of its coveted travel prize. Additionally, donations of artworks were received from private collectors, among which the imperial household, as well as from artists and their estates. In November 1889, a military coup overthrew the emperor and transformed Brazil into a republic. 1 year later, the Academy was reorganized as the National School of Fine Arts. Under the Republican regime, many of the key features that shaped the Academy's system of collecting were preserved and indeed perfected. General exhibitions proceeded to take place on a yearly basis, with concomitant annual awards of travel prizes and acquisition prizes, meaning more original works for the collection. This growth did not translate automatically, however, into a commensurate investment in exhibiting art to the public. Over the 19th century, the salons were the principal occasion when visitors viewed the collections of the Academy. The first attempts to put artworks on permanent display took place in the late 1850s and continued through the late imperial and early republican periods. However, they were often frustrated by limitations of space and infrastructure. The original Academy building, erected 1826, was subjected to continual renovations until the school was physically transferred in 1908 to a new building, purpose-built to house the National School of Fine Arts. 30 years later, the MNBA opened its doors in that same building, completing the transition from a study collection to a public museum of art. Throughout the 19th century, critical debates reveal a continuing concern with the Brazilianness of the art being collected. Though contemporary sources sometimes spoke of a national collection, a national gallery, and even a national museum, there was little consensus about what such terms might mean. On the contrary, from the 1850s onwards, a great deal of intellectual hand-wringing can be found in discussions of just what, if anything, made Brazilian art distinct from the European models upon which it was based. After the first generation of academicians passed away or returned to Europe, a new concern with national identity made itself felt among their disciples, especially those who identified with the Romantic movement, such as Manuel de Araújo Porto Alegre, seen here, who directed the Academy between 1854 and 1857, and was an ardent spokesman for national art. In a context where the artists of greatest recognition were foreign or trained abroad, Porto Alegre himself, for instance, studied in Paris under French masters like Debré and Gros. What characteristics might set Brazilian art apart and make it representative of a national culture? The issue came to a head in 1879 when the Salon and its catalog grouped together a set of 83 works by 18 artists produced between 1813 and 1879 and classified them as, quote, collection of national pictures constituting the Brazilian school, end quote. Among them was Victor Meirelles' First Mass in Brazil, exhibited in the Paris Salon in 1861, and the undisputed masterpiece up to that point of Brazilian art. It is a powerful piece of history painting, forging a foundational myth of the nation based on very clear discourses about nature and religion, indigenous origins, and the civilizing influence of Europe. Unfortunately, we do not have time to go into a more detailed reading of it today. I want to show it along with a few more pictures included in the 1879 collection to give you some idea of the type of art the Academy was promoting as representative of Brazil and its culture. Critics were less than convinced by the idea of a Brazilian school, particularly those who were hostile to the Academy for other reasons. What, in effect, made such works of art distinctively Brazilian? The fact that their authors or subjects were born in Brazil? That contention was a complicated one in a country that had recently emerged from 3 centuries of colonization, a country where the first head of state was a Portuguese monarch, a member of the line of succession of the French and Spanish houses of Orléans and Bragança, and where nearly half the population was excluded not only from any sense of cultural identity, but even basic civil rights, due to the omnipresent fact of slavery. The answer provided by many contemporary artists and writers, particularly but not exclusively those of Romantic persuasion, was to locate the essence of national identity in the land and its flora and fauna, the physical and geographical factors that shaped an experience of belonging. But local themes alone were insufficient to deflect the charge that they were depicting Brazil through European eyes and employing an imported and artificial style. This, of course, is the great accusation later levied against the Academy by the modern movement in the 1920s, which allowed modernists to lump together and sweep away the entire 19th century as unrepresentative, derivative, and backward. Even today, when we have gained sufficient historical perspective to question modernist claims to originality and have become more attuned to issues of cultural transfer, hybridity, and transculturation, there is still a weird, contrived quality that makes it impossible to talk about some of these works without recourse to Roberto Schwartz's notion of misplaced ideas. To what extent can such errant art ever be reconciled with standard practices of art history and museum display? With the classificatory instruments of schools and periods, styles and movements, as they have developed over the past 250 years. Such works defy the legitimacy of a concept like national culture, insofar as they align themselves with an artistic ideal that distances itself intentionally from time and place. They aspire to be universal, yet remain irredeemably provincial. Most issues of cultural identity were strategically sidestepped when the MNBA was created by presidential decree in January 1937. The museum's first director, Osvaldo Teixeira, a painter and former pupil of the Escola Nacional de Belas Artes, was a strident nationalist and prominent among the ranks of traditionalists then engaged in a culture war against modern art. He was a supporter of the Ação Integralista Brasileira, Brazil's own green-shirted fascist movement, for whom he designed the cover of the first issue of the magazine Anaue, shown here. At the time of his appointment in May 1937, the Integralistas were at the height of their popularity and were actively courted by Vargas for political support. The choice of Teixeira for director of the new museum was a clear nod in their direction. Now, Vargas is famous for leveraging all parties against each other to retain his grip on power. And it is true that he also co-opted segments of the left-leaning intelligentsia in the much more famous architectural project for the Ministry of Education and Health, built between 1936 and 1945 after design by Le Corbusier. Because of this strategy of moving back and forth between political extremes, it is important to bear in mind the timing of each cultural initiative by his regime. The MNBA was officially inaugurated in August 1938 in a ceremony attended by Vargas, who had by then assumed dictatorial powers. Its creation as an institution came at the highest point of a swing towards the right, which followed a prolonged anti-communist purge between 1936 and 1937. Essentially, the museum was established as a bulwark against modern art and its perceived connections to Bolshevism. During the turbulent years of the Estado Novo and the Second World War, The MNBA served both as a check on the ascendancy of modernism and as an affirmation of the regime's commitment to high culture. It was a showcase for Brazil's deep cultural connections to France, which could be wheeled out whenever necessary to demonstrate that the nation's sympathies lay with the Allies, no matter how much the policies of its government might swing towards Berlin and Rome, which they did with alarming frequency between 1936 and 1942. With landmark temporary exhibitions celebrating the European heritage of Brazilian art, such as the French Artistic Mission of 1816 in 1940, or France Post in 1942, and a permanent display structured around the legacy of the Academy, the museum presented a Eurocentric vision of Brazilian art. For an institution run by a rabid nationalist, it was decidedly cosmopolitan. After Vargas was deposed in October 1945, the institution entered a new period of uncertainty. The return to democracy not only reversed the fortunes of those modernists and leftists who had been proscribed since the 1930s, it also brought back the nagging question of what to do with all that unnational art. Since its inception in 1937, the MNBA had been subordinated administratively to the newly created National Heritage Service, then known by its acronym SPHAN, or SFAN, as we say in Portuguese. There, in typical Vargas fashion, a different political faction had been put in charge, creating a permanent power struggle between the Heritage Service and the directors of its two most important museums, both of whom were run by integralistas. With the defeat of fascism abroad and its wane on the domestic front, the battle lines between traditionalists and modernists were redrawn and entered a new and enduring phase of Cold War. The solution adopted by Osvaldo Teixeira and his staff was to retreat into the more neutral realm of museology. The museum's collections were packaged as art treasures for the nation, and their preservation became the logic of institutional survival. The tone of the times can be found in an article by reporter Adalberto Mário Ribeiro, written for the Revista do Serviço Público in December 1945. The bemused newspaper veteran recounts at length a visit to the museum, during which he is brushed off by a surly Teixeira, and then shown around by the director's deputy, Regina Monteiro Real, one of the leading museologists of her day. The four photographs you see here, in black and white, were published as illustrations to that article. The reporter stresses the monetary value of the collections, 34 million cruzeiros according to his figures. But his greatest enthusiasm is reserved for the new storage facilities and the work of the museum's conservation staff. An object like the Miravel painting shown here, seemingly so divorced from the prevailing discussions about modernity and national culture, is simply summed up in the caption as, quote, one of the jewels of the museum, end quote. With another dictatorship in power during the 1970s, the separation of the National School of Fine Arts from the MNBA was finally completed. Though they had been distinct institutions administratively since 1937, museum and school continued to share the same address, as well as deep bonds of personnel and tradition. In 1975, the School of Fine Arts, no longer national, but simply a division of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, was moved 12 kilometers north to its present location on the university's main campus. The two institutions' twinned collections were divided according to criteria that have yet to be duly studied and problematized. The guiding principle was that whatever was of purely pedagogic or historical interest would go to the school, while works of higher artistic import would remain with the museum. The trick there, of course, is to draw the line between art education, and art history. In actual fact, the museum continues to collect and display works that were clearly acquired for teaching purposes, such as the impressive collection of casts from the antique, you see here, that occupies pride of place in one of its principal galleries, while the school possesses works that could rightly hang in the museum, such as Maximiano Mafra's Cane Cursed, which was included in the Brazilian school collection of 1879. The practical guideline for what was excluded from the museum's collections in 1937 seems to have had more to do with what the curators found uninteresting or simply too embarrassing to display. Faced with the unenviable task of caring for a collection of nearly 10,000 objects, including paintings, sculpture, prints and drawings, photographs, textiles, furniture, porcelain, and metals, the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro created its own museum, the Museu Dom João VI, in 1979. Chronically underfunded and understaffed, embroiled in institutional infighting, and situated in a location that is inhospitable to any but the most persevering, this spin-off museum has become the almost exclusive preserve of researchers working on the history of the Academy. It is a sadly insular destination for a fragment of a collection that once aspired to represent not only an ideal of national culture, but also universal artistic values. Yet, it is also somehow fitting that the collections have not managed to hold together as a unified whole. The inability to forge a representative institution of national art befits a nation-state historically founded on the violent suppression of cultural difference, as well as on an ongoing refusal to reflect on the mistakes of its past. To build a nation at war with itself, it takes many museums to fight for the spoils. Thank you.